The ritual of awakening will either forge a hero or create a corpse. As Kael faces his deadliest trial yet, ancient magic tears him apart from the inside. But in the royal vaults of Eldengard, something far older stirs. The Obsidian Crown, a relic from the First Shadow War, whispering promises of power to a desperate king. Some artifacts should remain buried. Some doors should never be opened. And some prices are far too high to pay, even for victory. The Chamber of Convergence existed at the absolute heart of the Sanctum, deeper than even the Oracle's sphere, in a place where the boundaries between realms grew thin as silk. Kael stood at its center, barefoot on stone that pulsed with ancient warmth, and tried to control his breathing. Fear threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced it down, channeled it into determination. Around him, in a perfect circle, stood the 7 masters of the Sanctum. Aldric directly before him, the others spaced evenly, each one radiating power that made the air shimmer. They had removed their usual robes, wearing instead simple white garments marked with silver runes that glowed softly in the chamber's dim light. Their faces were solemn, ritual-focused, but Kael caught glimpses of concern in Aldric's eyes. "Once we begin," the master said, his voice formal and measured, "there is no stopping. The ritual will run its course. You will either integrate your dual nature and emerge awakened, or you will be consumed by the conflicting energies and cease to exist. Your body will remain, but empty. A husk. Do you understand?" "I understand," Kael replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "The pain will be beyond anything you've experienced. Beyond anything you can imagine. You will want to scream, to beg us to stop, to surrender to oblivion just to make it end. You must not surrender. You must hold on to your sense of self while everything you are is torn apart and remade." "I'm ready." Aldric studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Your mother said the same words, standing exactly where you stand now, 17 years old and terrified but too proud to show it. I hoped I would never have to do this ritual again. But fate, it seems, has a cruel sense of symmetry." He raised his hands, and the other masters mirrored the gesture. "We begin." The 7 voices spoke in unison, words in a language older than the kingdoms of men, older than the forests and mountains, a language that had existed when the first Luminari emerged from pure starlight and took form in the material realms. The words resonated not in Kael's ears but in his bones, his blood, the very core of his being. The runes carved into the chamber floor blazed to life with silver fire. They formed intricate patterns, circles within circles, geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to shift and change even as Kael watched. The patterns began to rotate, slowly at first, then faster, creating a whirlpool of light with Kael at its center. Energy rose from the floor, passing through him like water through a net, and where it touched, Kael felt something inside him crack. The seal his mother had placed, the barrier between his human half and his Luminari heritage, began to fracture. Pain exploded through his body. It started at the mark on his shoulder, a burning so intense that Kael gasped, his hands moving instinctively to clutch at it. The crescent moon and vertical line blazed like a brand pressed into flesh, but the pain didn't stay localized. It spread, following pathways through his body that he'd never known existed, tracing lines of silver fire under his skin. "Don't fight it." Aldric's voice came from somewhere far away. "Let it flow. Let it break you." The energy intensified. Kael's back arched involuntarily as power surged through him, far more than he'd ever channeled before, far more than his body seemed capable of containing. He felt like a vessel too small for its contents, stretched to the breaking point and beyond. His vision exploded into silver light, and suddenly he wasn't in the chamber anymore. He stood in a city of impossible beauty, towers of crystal and silver reaching toward twin moons that hung huge and luminous in a purple sky. The Silver City, his birthplace, though he'd never seen it except in visions. But this wasn't a vision, it was a memory, pulled from blood and bone, from the deepest part of his heritage. The city was alive, thriving, filled with beings of light that moved through the streets with casual grace. Luminari in their prime, before the fall. They were beautiful beyond human measure, their skin faintly luminous, their eyes holding depths of ancient knowledge. Some had wings of pure energy that folded against their backs. Others manipulated light itself, shaping it into art, into architecture, into wonders that human minds could barely comprehend. And there, standing on a balcony overlooking the city, was his mother. Queen Elindra was younger here, perhaps in her 20s by human reckoning, though age worked differently for the Luminari. She wore armor of silver scale that seemed to be made of solidified moonlight, and her hair, the same dark color as Kael's, was bound in an intricate braid woven with threads of starlight. She was laughing at something, her face radiant with joy, and Kael felt his heart clench. This was before the war, before the fall, before she had to sacrifice everything to save a son who would never know her. The scene shifted, time accelerating. The sky darkened. The twin moons turned blood red. Cracks appeared in the perfect towers as something vast and terrible pressed against the fabric of the realm itself. The Shadow King was coming. Kael watched, trapped in the memory, unable to look away, as the first shadow creatures poured through rifts in reality. The Luminari fought back with light and power, with weapons that could cut through dimensions and magic that could unmake existence itself. But for every shadow creature destroyed, 10 more emerged. For every rift sealed, 3 more tore open. The war was brutal and absolute. It raged for what might have been days or years. Time broke down as the realms collided. Kael saw his mother leading armies of light, saw her cut through shadow forces with a blade that blazed like a captured star. The Star Blade. He recognized it from Thessir's description. But even the Star Blade couldn't turn the tide against endless darkness. The Silver City fell tower by tower, crystal by crystal. The Luminari died or fled, their light extinguished or scattered across the realms. And finally, the Shadow King himself emerged from the largest rift, a being of such concentrated malevolence that his mere presence caused reality to warp and decay. He was not a shape Kael could fully comprehend. His mind skittered away from trying to process the geometry of that terrible form. But the eyes, those Kael saw clearly. Burning voids that held nothing but hunger and hate and the absolute certainty of dominion. The final battle between Queen Elindra and the Shadow King shook the foundations of the realm. Light and dark clashed with apocalyptic force. Mountains shattered. Oceans boiled. The sky itself cracked like broken glass. And she was losing. Kael wanted to scream, to help, to do something, but he was just a ghost in the memory, powerless to change what had already happened. He saw the moment she realized she couldn't win. Saw the decision form in her eyes. Terrible, necessary, final. She called the last of the Luminari who still lived, gathered them in the throne room of the collapsing palace, and spoke words of power that would drain her life force to its last spark. She created the portal, the final escape route, and she placed a hand on her belly, where an infant not yet born slept, protected by layers of shielding magic. "You will live," she whispered, and Kael heard the words as if she spoke directly to him across 17 years and the gulf of death. "You will grow strong. You will remember who you are. And when the darkness comes again, because it will come again, it always does, you will stand against it. Not because you must. Not because of duty or destiny. But because you choose to. That choice, my son, is the only power that truly matters." She cut herself open with the Star Blade, not physically but spiritually, removing the infant from her body through pure magic, pulling Kael from her womb months before he would have been naturally born. She wrapped him in protective spells, in layers of shielding and sealing, then cast him through the portal just as the Shadow King's forces breached the throne room. The last thing Kael saw in the memory was his mother turning to face the Shadow King, the Star Blade in her hands blazing with all the light she had left, a defiant smile on her lips even as darkness swallowed her. The memory shattered. Kael snapped back to the chamber of convergence, gasping, tears streaming down his face. But there was no time to process the grief, because the ritual was far from over. The energy pouring through him had intensified while he'd been lost in the memory. His body was lifting off the ground now, suspended in the whirlpool of silver light, rotating slowly as the magic worked. He could feel it in his cells, in his DNA, rewriting the fundamental code of his being. The human parts of him, the parts that Marcus and Elena had raised, that had plowed fields and lived simply and known nothing of magic, screamed in protest. This was too much, too alien, too other. His mind tried to reject it, to hold on to the familiar. But the Luminari parts of him, the heritage written in his blood, the power that had slept for 17 years, surged forward, demanding recognition, demanding integration. Two halves of one whole, tearing him apart in their struggle for dominance. Accept both. Aldric's voice cut through the chaos. You are not one or the other, you are both. Human and Luminari. The fusion is your strength, not your weakness. Easy to say. Impossible to do. How could he be both? How could he reconcile the simple farm boy with the Prince of Light? How could the mundane and the magical coexist in one body, one mind, one soul? The answer came not in words but in sensation. A memory, smaller and more personal than the visions of the Silver City. Himself at age 7, working in the fields with his father. Marcus showing him how to read the soil, how to know when it was ready for planting. His father's rough, calloused hands gentle as they guided Kael's smaller hands. Feel it, Marcus had said. Don't think. Don't guess. Feel. The earth will tell you what it needs if you listen. And Kael had listened. Had felt the soil's readiness, its hunger for seed, its willingness to nurture. It had been magic of a sort, though he hadn't known it then. The magic of connection, of understanding, of being part of something larger than himself. That was what he needed now. Not to choose between his natures but to feel how they connected, how they could work together. He stopped fighting. Stopped trying to control or direct the energies. Just let them flow, let them find their own balance within him. The pain didn't stop, if anything, it intensified to levels that should have shattered his consciousness. But Kael's perspective shifted. The pain became information. Data. His body was being reconstructed at the cellular level, pathways of power being etched into his nervous system, his very DNA being rewritten to accommodate the full expression of his dual heritage. It hurt because he was changing, evolving, becoming. The silver light around him pulsed in time with his heartbeat, faster and faster, brighter and brighter. The 7 masters strained to maintain the containment field, sweat pouring down their faces, their own power being drained to dangerous levels. And then, with a sound like crystal bells and distant thunder, something locked into place. Kael's eyes snapped open, not the brown eyes of a farm boy but eyes of pure silver, glowing within a light. The mark on his shoulder blazed like a star, its light penetrating through flesh and cloth. Every vein in his body was visible, carrying luminous energy instead of just blood. He understood. The power wasn't separate from him. It was him. His human experiences, his memories of simple life and honest work, they weren't weaknesses to overcome, they were the foundation that made him strong. The Luminari power gave him strength, but his humanity gave him purpose, compassion, reason to fight. His mother had known. That's why she'd sent him to live as a human. Not just to hide him, but to give him something the Luminari of the Silver City had sometimes lacked, connection to the ordinary, to the simple, to the lives they were meant to protect. The ritual reached its crescendo. Energy exploded outward from Kael's body in a sphere of pure silver light that would have destroyed the chamber if not for the master's containment. As it was, the walls cracked, runes blazing so bright they burned after images into retinas. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm of power subsided. Kael descended slowly to the floor, his feet touching stone gently. The silver light faded from his eyes, returning them to brown, but with a luminous quality that hadn't been there before. The veins of light under his skin dimmed to invisibility, but the power remained, flowing through him as naturally as breath. He stood transformed. Not taller or more muscular, the changes were deeper than physical. But everything about him radiated a quiet, controlled power that made the air around him shimmer. Aldric lowered his hands, exhaustion clear on his face, but his eyes were bright with triumph. "Welcome back, Prince Kael. How do you feel?" Kael looked at his hands, watching silver light dance across his palms at the slightest thought. "Alive," he said. "For the first time, truly alive." He looked up at Aldric. "And I remember. Not everything, but pieces. The Silver City. My mother. The war. It's all there, in my blood, in my bones." "The ritual unlocks what was always there," Aldric said. "Your mother's seal didn't just hide your power, it suppressed your inherited memories, the knowledge passed down through Luminari bloodlines. Now you have access to it all. It will take time to process, to understand, but you'll find you know things you never learned." It was true. Kael could feel it, a vast library of knowledge sitting at the edge of his consciousness. Combat techniques he'd never practiced but somehow understood. The true names of ancient places and beings. The fundamental laws that governed how light and energy and the spaces between realms functioned. "How long was I?" Kael began, then stopped as the chamber door burst open. Seraphine stood in the doorway, her face pale, eyes wide with urgency. "Master Aldric, something's happened in Eldengard. The scrying pools, you need to see this now." The exhaustion on Aldric's face transformed to alarm. "What now?" "The king," Seraphine said. "He's opened the royal vaults. He's found the Obsidian Crown." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop 10 degrees. Aldric's expression went from alarm to horror. No, he couldn't be that foolish. "What's the Obsidian Crown?" Kael asked, following as Aldric and the other masters rushed from the chamber, their exhaustion forgotten in the face of this new crisis. "A relic from the last Shadow War, 300 years ago," Aldric explained as they ran through corridors toward the scrying room. "King Aldric I, your current king is the third of that name, faced a shadow incursion much like what's happening now. He was losing. His armies couldn't fight the shadow creatures. So he made a deal." "With what?" "With something that lived in the spaces between light and dark. Something that claimed it could give him the power to defeat the shadows. It forged the Obsidian Crown and offered it freely. King Aldric I wore it, and yes, he won the war. But the crown had a price." They burst into the scrying room, where students and masters crowded around the largest pool. The water showed the royal palace of Eldengard, deep in the vaults beneath the throne room. King Aldric III stood before an ancient stone pedestal, upon which rested a crown of black metal that seemed to absorb light. Its design was beautiful and terrible. Twisted spires that resembled both flame and thorns, set with gems that glowed with a sickly purple light. Around the king stood his royal guard and several advisors, all looking uncertain. One of the advisors, an elderly man in sorcerer's robes, was speaking urgently. "Your Majesty, please reconsider. The records are clear. King Aldric I defeated the shadow incursion. Yes, but at great cost. The crown corrupted him. By the end of his life, he was barely human, consumed by paranoia and cruelty. It took his own son to..." "To what?" King Aldric III interrupted. "Say it." "It took his son to assassinate him in his sleep because the crown's influence made him mad. I know the histories, Castellan. But that was 300 years ago. King Aldric I wore the crown for 30 years. I need it only for days, perhaps weeks, just long enough to drive back the shadow creatures and restore order." "That's what he said too," the old sorcerer replied quietly. "At first, he promised himself he'd wear it only until the crisis passed. But the crown doesn't let go easily." The king stared at the crown, and even through the scrying pool, Kael could see the hunger in his eyes, the desperate hope of a man watching his kingdom crumble. "My people are dying. Shadow creatures hunt in my streets. My armies are useless. My sorcerer's powerless. The Sanctum offers prophecies and warnings but no real help. What choice do I have? Any choice but this one, the sorcerer begged. Your Majesty, please. But King Aldric III had already reached out. His fingers touched the cold black metal of the Obsidian Crown. The reaction was immediate and terrible. Power erupted from the crown in waves of dark purple energy that knocked everyone in the vault to the ground. The king's scream echoed off stone walls as the crown's power poured into him, flooding through his body with force that should have killed him instantly. But it didn't kill him. Instead, it changed him. His eyes went from blue to purple, glowing with an inner light that was wrong, corrupted, beautiful and revolting all at once. Black veins spread from where his hands touched the crown, racing up his arms like poison, but when they finished spreading, his flesh nipped back to normal, almost normal. His skin had taken on a faint pallor, and his presence, even viewed through the scrying pool, had changed. Enhanced. Dangerous. King Aldric III lifted the Obsidian Crown from its pedestal and, with shaking hands, placed it upon his head. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the king smiled, and it was the smile of a predator, not a protector. "Oh," he whispered, his voice layered with harmonics that shouldn't come from a human throat. "Oh, I understand now. The power. I can feel it all. Every shadow in my kingdom, every dark corner, every hidden thing. And I can command them." "Your Majesty." The old sorcerer picked himself up from the floor cautiously. "Are you, yourself?" "More than myself," the king replied. He raised his hand, and shadow coalesced in his palm, not the writhing, chaotic darkness of the shadow creatures, but controlled, purposeful shadow that bent to his will. "I am what I was meant to be. A true king. A strong king. One who doesn't beg mystical cults for help but takes power into his own hands." He turned and strode from the vault, his movement stronger, more confident than before. The guards and advisors scrambled to follow. The scrying pool tracked them as they ascended from the vaults into the palace proper, through halls filled with worried servants and nobles. Word had already spread. The king had done something drastic in the vaults, and the air itself felt different, charged with an energy that made everyone nervous. King Aldric III emerged onto the palace balcony that overlooked the city. Elden Guard spread before him, its streets still chaotic with shadow creatures hunting and people fleeing in panic. He raised his hands, the Obsidian Crown glinting in the light of burning buildings, and spoke a single word in a language that predated human civilization. The response was instantaneous. Every shadow creature in the city froze mid-hunt. They turned, as one, toward the palace. Toward their new master. "Return," the king commanded, his voice carrying across the city with supernatural force. "Return to the darkness from which you came. This realm is under my protection now. You have no power here." The shadow creatures didn't flee or dissolve. Instead, they bowed. Then, like smoke pulled by a wind, they flowed toward the palace, converging on the square before it. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, gathering in a massive pool of living darkness. The king gestured, and the darkness condensed, compressed, forced itself into smaller and smaller space until it formed a single sphere of concentrated shadow hovering above the square. With another gesture, he sent it skyward, where it exploded in a burst of harmless night that dissipated into the atmosphere. Silence fell across Eldengard. Then, tentatively at first but building quickly, cheering erupted. The shadow creatures were gone. The king had saved them. Their prayers had been answered. But in the Sanctum, watching through the scrying pool, no one cheered. "He's made a terrible mistake," Aldric said quietly. "The crown gives power over shadows, yes. But it doesn't banish them, it binds the wearer to them. It makes him part shadow himself. The more he uses it, the more he'll become what he's fighting against." "Can we stop him?" Kael asked. Can we get the crown away from him? Not without killing him, and maybe not even then. The crown bonds to its wearer. It becomes part of them. King Aldric I's son tried to remove it while his father slept. The crown killed him for the attempt, then drove the king so deep into madness that he slaughtered half the court before he was finally stopped. So what do we do? Aldric turned away from the pool, his face grave. We prepare for the worst. The king thinks he's gained a weapon against the Shadow King. In truth, he's given the enemy a foothold in the highest levels of Eldorian power. The crown will corrupt him, slowly but inevitably. And when it does, when the Shadow King's influence reaches through the crown to claim him fully. He trailed off, the implications too terrible to voice. Kael felt the power flowing through his newly awakened body and knew it wouldn't be enough. Even with his full Luminari heritage unlocked, even with the knowledge of ages in his blood, he wasn't ready to face a king wearing an artifact of shadow corruption. But he would have to be ready. The chess pieces were moving faster now, the game accelerating toward its terrible conclusion. How long? He asked quietly. How long before the crown fully corrupts him? King Aldric I lasted 30 years, Aldric replied. But he fought it, resisted with all his will. King Aldric III, he's desperate, afraid, and convinced the crown is his salvation. He won't resist. Days, perhaps. A week at most before the corruption becomes visible. A month before he's too far gone to save. Then we have a month, Kael said. To find the Starblade. To prepare. To become strong enough to do what needs to be done. He looked back at the scrying pool, where the image showed King Aldric III basking in the adoration of his people, the obsidian crown glinting darkly on his head, the first tendrils of shadow beginning to pool in the corners of his smile. Some victories were worse than defeats. Some solutions created greater problems than they solved. And some prices, once paid, could never be refunded. The king had saved his city. But in doing so, he damned his soul and potentially doomed his kingdom. And somewhere in the spaces between realms, in a throne room of bone and shadow, the Shadow King felt the obsidian crown awaken and smiled his terrible smile. The trap was set. The poison was administered. Now all he had to do was wait for the corruption to spread and the harvest to ripen. The war between light and shadow had entered a new phase. And the darkness had just claimed a powerful piece on the board.